Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly conversation about European politics. I'm Maeve McMahon in Brussels. Thank you so much for tuning in. Coming up, not yet in the White House, but he's already on the world stage. US President-elect Donald Trump was Paris's guest of honour last week, alongside Ukraine's President Zelensky at a mass celebrating the reopening of Notre Dame Cathedral. Beyond the smiles, this was highly delicate diplomacy in an increasingly chaotic world. With the Ukraine-Russia war rumbling on, fears of a dangerous power vacuum in Syria and concerns that Trump's tariffs will shake the European economy, we hear if Brussels is prepared. And all eyes on Emmanuel Macron. The French president is knee-deep in political hot water after his government, led by former Prime Minister Michel Barnier, collapsed. With mountains of public debt and a messy budget, Macron said he will still lead his country until 2027. But with no clear majority and voters leaning further to the left and to the right, we ask, could France become the new sick man of Europe? A warm welcome to our guests this weekend. Bart Shevchik from the German Marshall Fund, a global policy expert and a professor with Sciences Po. Welcome.
Great to be here, thanks.
Maria Tadeo, correspondent with Le Grand Continent. Welcome.
Thank you so much and congratulations for the 100 shows. It's fantastic to be here.
Great to have you with us for it. And Nassim Ashouch, a policy expert with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
Well, lovely to have you all. But as usual, we like to just give some context to our viewers before we hear your analysis. And we're going to hear why world leaders got together last weekend.
It was like reliving the breathtaking awe that Notre Dame Cathedral would have inspired among medieval Christians. But the official reopening was as much a diplomatic as an ecclesiastic occasion. Bringing together Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, French President Emmanuel Macron signaled one of the priorities of 2025: ending the war in Ukraine one way or the other. For Trump, it was a luminous return to the world stage and a high society recognition from European leaders anxious over the direction of his second administration. Will he force Ukraine into a peace with Russia? Will he leave the NATO alliance? Will he hit the EU economy with more tariffs? The ceremony at Notre Dame ended with a 4th century Te Deum, a song of praise that some observers saw as fitting to keep Europe in Trump's good graces.
So powerful images there. Firstly, it's nice to see the cathedral reopen. Finally, some good news after the disturbing images 5 years ago. Good for tourists, good for worshippers.
No, definitely. Look, it was an amazing performance. Actually, I was in Paris over the weekend, incidentally, and it was stunning how many people were there, and it was really beautiful to see. And it was very important for President-elect Trump to have been there, and I thought that was a very nice gesture on his part to come to Paris to be part of this ceremony and part of this occasion, and even more importantly, to then have a good bilateral meeting with President Macron, and even more importantly, a trilateral with President Zelensky. So I thought all those gestures set the right mood music in a way. He even wore a yellow tie with the blue suit. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but if it was warmly received. But now we'll see how that translates into actual policies when the new team comes to power. And I think the key question will be for the new team and for Europe, whether U.S. weapon supplies continue being delivered to Ukraine. That will be the central question for everyone.
Because, of course, behind those pictures was a lot of diplomacy. There was a big dinner then in the Élysée Palace afterwards with a number of delegates who were also invited. It was the first trip abroad for President-elect Donald Trump. Maria, quite interesting. We need to get used to those pictures.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, politics is about symbols and gestures. And obviously, we had a big one with that picture of President Trump, Emmanuel Macron, and President Zelensky. That was a very powerful image. To me, what is also very relevant is that we're already seeing in some way that the European leadership is not waiting for January to start this relationship with the new administration. And I think by now this really changes from the previous time, is that they know how he operates. They know that in some ways President Trump is about symbols, is about presenting himself as the winner in some ways, but it's also a transactional relationship in a number of areas. I thought it was very interesting, too, that Elon Musk was there. I think we've entered a time of new politics and a new way of doing politics. And it was also fascinating to see how everyone, and by that I mean the EU27, they all tried to get time alone with President Trump and really show, well, I'm in a good relationship with him, because I think what we're going to see, and this is going to be fascinating to watch, is leaders will want to show they have the best relationship with Trump, that they are the best interlocutor with President Trump. And I think that was interesting for Macron, but also Meloni try to have this one-on-one moment. And that was also very interesting.
Yeah, because Giorgia Meloni, she was there, and Viktor Orban, meanwhile, was over in Mar-a-Lago this week. But, Nassim, there was no President von der Leyen there. There was no EU Council President Antonio Costa there at this huge event in Paris. Why not?
Well, yes, I think this was not the absence of any kind of higher EU representation during the very expected ceremony. What signal is Macron sending here? Maybe we know that he's actually wanting to take a leadership position within the European. The European representation, and he's definitely not waiting for any sign from Ursula von der Leyen to...
Well, according to Ursula von der Leyen's press people, it was due to scheduling issues, Maria Tadeo. That's why she wasn't there. But was it a missed opportunity for her?
Look, I think there's two issues, and this is going to be a very delicate question, by the way. Ursula von der Leyen had a very close relationship, remember, with the Biden administration. She had a very close relationship with the entire administration. For President Trump, we know that he does not like, to some extent, the EU institutions, that he believes they represent something that he doesn't fully understand, or even worse, it's negative for the U.S. economy. So I think that she will struggle to shift from close relationship with the Biden administration to close relationship with the Trump administration. The other issue, of course, is the elephant in the room. She was busy coming back from a flight from Latin America because she had just signed the Mercosur agreement, which, of course, the French have said repeatedly they oppose. That was a big move from Ursula von der Leyen to go and sign that kind of agreement, knowing a member state like the French government is fully and so vocally against. So I find it very difficult to believe this was just the agendas clashing. It's high diplomacy. I'm sure von der Leyen, who also likes to be in these kind of formats, would normally be there unless the context, of course, was so difficult in that day for her.
Yeah, and the Mercosur massive trade agreement we'll come to a little bit later in the show. But Bart, you sound very positive about Donald Trump stepping down and taking this first trip. But do you think down deeply he really cares about the Europeans?
Well, I think
he showed up late. He showed up 40 minutes late.
He showed up late, but I think we're probably in for some rough waters over the next several months, because the new Trump team will still need to decide exactly what posture they want to adopt with respect to Europe. So, the big open question is around providing weapons to Ukraine and the overall Ukraine policy, and also what to do with respect to NATO, and to what extent, are the ironclad commitments to NATO from the United States as ironclad as they have been. And incidentally, even as he was in Paris over the weekend, President-elect Trump also gave an interview to NBC's Meet the Press, where he was equivocal a little bit about NATO.
It was a very interesting interview. We also took a look, and we can share with our viewers, in fact, what he said on that NBC interview, because the concern here, of course, Bart, is whether he'll pull out of NATO or whether he'll stop funding Ukraine. And he said very clearly, I was able to get hundreds of billions of dollars put into NATO with a tough attitude. And he said, if members are paying their bills, I will remain in NATO. And then regarding Ukraine, should they expect less aid? Sure. So, yeah, playing a little bit hot and cold there, Nassim.
Yeah, well, in one way, it's hard to imagine the US pulling out of NATO suddenly. But at the same time, we know that with President Donald Trump, what we can expect is unpredictability. But what we can understand behind the lines is the fact that Trump wants now for the European countries and other allies to pay for US leadership, and that's made pretty clear in his statements.
And his choice... Go ahead, Bart.
No, I was going to just follow up on this. One area of potential compromise here, and I think the two sides are still feeling each other out and trying to see what is the area of compromise. But one possible way out of this impasse is that Europeans raise a lot of funding to purchase US weapons to continue to be supplied to Ukraine. Now, this will shift the cost from the US to Europe increasingly on the tune of 50 billion euro per year over 4 years. That could be around 200 billion. But this is one way in which Ukraine can still be supported, can still be able to defend itself, but the cost burden shifted from the United States to Europe.
And is that something we can afford, Maria Tadeo, and sell to our voters and our public?
Look, it's complicated because also this conversation, I'm happy you brought this up, because this conversation is happening at a time in which Europe is also saying we want to create our own defense industry and we want to create our own industrial policy, and we need to really kickstart our economy again so that we're in some ways on a stronger footing globally. So here you're presenting a difficult scenario where you have to choose, is this a sort of relationship where in order to tame President Trump, you have to approach the U.S. with a deal that in some ways contradicts your own internal policies, but also contradicts the message that you're sending to the public opinion, because the entire message from this new commission is based on competitive, so stronger economy, stronger European economy, but also stronger European security for Europeans.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that one thing to also remember and restate here is that this should be also a signal for Europe. We have a far right or a right-wing president in the U.S. that is taking reassessing the partnership with its allies, and Europe needs to think of what they want, which road they want to follow now.
But it's not the first time they'll be dealing with President Trump, and many talk about NATO being Trump-proof. Is that the case, Bart?
Well, look, you can't take out politics from institutions. So the U.S. is the key player in NATO, and it's incredibly important what the Trump team will decide with respect to NATO, and what President Trump himself will say with respect to the ironclad commitments that the U.S. has had towards NATO thus far. Look, on the whole, I think the logic of transatlantic cooperation and partnership remains solid, and so I think the new Trump team will rally around that. But it's going to be, a little bit of an up and down 4 years probably, where you have on the one hand, very nice gestures like the visit to Notre Dame in Paris, and on the other hand, comments on Meet the Press where it will raise some eyebrows in Europe, whether, which side do you sort of put your money on?
Because on that interview as well, Donald Trump was clearly screaming at the Europeans for not buying American products. And he said, we won't be paying for you guys anymore. We won't be defending you. But he has put Marco Rubio in place, Maria, as his Secretary of State. Marco Rubio, a couple of years ago as well, put in legislation that would require that any presidential decision to exit NATO must have 2/3 Senate approval. So it won't be quite simple just for him to act on what he wants.
Exactly. And again, I think already in this conversation, we've talked about the different sort of souls that you can get within the administration and the different sort of understandings or ways of seeing the world within the administration. Obviously, there's some that still believe, and Rubio could be one, that NATO is incredibly important because of the deterrence that is sending to the world. Also, there is a commitment for Europe and others within the administration that we know believe ultimately European security should fall in the hands of the Europeans, and the U.S. has to pivot very hard, even harder into Asia, because China is the big existential question for the U.S. There's two things, however, I would say that perhaps make it easier in some ways. Mark Rutte, who's now the Secretary General, look, I think he's shown he's a good diplomat already, because he, I believe, understands President Trump. He said a number of times, look, we need to stop talking about President Trump as a problem to NATO. We need to change that conversation. Secondly, he was right.
That's why he visited him too.
Exactly. There's a number of assessments that the president was right on. He's also been very clear on that, saying, look, President Trump, in some of the assessments that Europe was underprepared for a war, he was proven right. And then secondly, I think for Europeans, it is now clear that this is a transactional relationship, so that changes now. But if you pay, President Trump is probably happy to run along, but you have to pay.
And that's the key word, Maria, isn't it? Transactional. I think that's the key word we have to bear in mind. But of course, Donald Trump has also said that when he becomes president, his main aim will be to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, he said.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what Maria's just said, and exactly you've underlined the fact that the main the main problem for the US right now is the question of China. And I think again that the EU should be reassessing their following of the US, especially in the NATO leadership, and looking at what is their interest with China and with the US right now, especially looking also at the question of like green industrialization race that is happening.
And I think at this point, if I may just say, there are points where the US and Europe, are becoming aligned. One is obviously no full decouple from China, but yes to de-risking your economy from China. The US loves to hear that. Also on the EVs, we're seeing now tariffs potentially on Chinese goods and Chinese products. That's something the administration appreciates and values. But also there's a shared understanding that China should have played a much, much bigger role in Ukraine, and it failed to do so. So there is disappointment in the positioning that China has taken, not just when it comes to Ukraine, but also just vis-a-vis China and this Russia.
Week, wasn't Robert Fico, he was over in Brazil reacting to the Brazil-China deal made to bring peace to Ukraine. But Zelensky, for his part, said, not on my terms, because Ukraine is not involved in that deal.
Right. No, I think, look, on China policy, I think the new team is still trying to decide exactly how much de-risking or decoupling they want to do. And I think they'll move probably a little bit more in the direction of decoupling. So there might be some tensions with Europe there. On Ukraine, I think this is the central question, what the Trump team will do. And, what are the terms of proposed negotiations with Russia. Now, of course, we could end the war in 24 hours if Russia just stops fighting and invading Ukraine. This is, very much doable. But how to get there and how to put pressure on Russia to do so is another question. And so those specific steps will still need to be thought through by the new team. And it's a good team between Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, and Special Envoy Kellogg. And so, I think they are going to be thinking seriously about the various elements. And I think a key part of it will be to make sure that Ukraine continues to be supplied with weapons, because if they don't have weapons, if they don't have the ammunition, the missiles, the tanks, and so forth, they will not be able to continue defending themselves, and then they'll just be overrun. So that's the key element. And then, politics is an unpredictable business. We saw what happened in Syria just in the course of 5 days. It's possible
we'll come to Syria in just a minute.
Could cave as well.
Indeed. And just regarding Vladimir Putin, we know that Donald Trump, according to that NBC interview, did not call him yet, but will once he gets into office. But also MEPs in Brussels here were debating all these various issues, and also whether or not Donald Trump could end that war, as he has promised. For one take, we caught up with the Lithuanian MEP, Petras Auštrevičius, to hear what he thought. Take a listen.
To handle this very sensitive issue with the Russian Federation, it takes time, it takes strength, it takes wisdom. I mean, I would probably put on brakes any easy belief that this war can end in one day, in one kind of a meeting format or whatever. It might become a frozen conflict, even more dangerous than it is now. Might be expanding to different shapes and regions. So that's why it must be agreed well before it is announced. It must be agreed with Ukrainians.
So that was Petras Auštrevičius there, stressing the sensitivities, of course, of dealing with the Kremlin. Just to add as well, we saw Donald Tusk, the Polish president, say that negotiations could start this winter on bringing an end to that war. Poland will be taking over the EU presidency. Maria, what is your thoughts on this?
Well, Ukrainians are obviously going to have to be very smart now with the choices that they make and will make from now on, and they will have to be very strategic. I've had a number of Ukrainian officials who have said to me, look, what we need to tell Trump, and language really will matter, perhaps, is to shift from the idea of victory plan to the idea of a peace plan, to really sort of put a form of language that is cohesive with the message that President Trump wants to send to the American people. Again, his message was very clear. I don't want wars. I want to end all of this. I think the other big question, and this is the biggest concern probably for Europeans, is that we've now entered a very delicate phase in which, it's possible. I'm not saying it's the likely scenario, this is the final endgame, but it is possible that President Trump will call the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and he will call President Zelensky, and he will say, this is the deal. You have to work with me on this deal. For the Europeans, if they're not involved at the table and they're not involved in the talks, this would be tremendously negative. But also we cannot forget that whatever happens to Ukraine, whether we like it or not, it's a European country and it affects the European security architecture. So this is a very delicate phase that now we're about to enter.
And just finally, another major region that impacts us as well is Syria and what happened there this week. We saw Kaja Kallas, the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, meet with MEPs to discuss it this week. There'll also be a Foreign Affairs meeting next Monday here in Brussels. How should the EU play a role here?
Well, I think this is a very tough and delicate questions of the role of the EU to enter in Syria right now, when we are saying, of course, what we have to cheer the fall down of the brutal and terrible regime of Bashar al-Assad. But what we are confronting a lot of doubt about the role and the real determination of the current regime in Syria.
And just on asylum procedures for Syrians based here in Brussels, or in Europe, they've all been put on hold in many countries. Is that the way to go, or is it too hasty?
Well, that might be a little bit too hasty because, it's tough to establish a safe environment for refugees to return to a country only 24 to 48 hours after the fall of a dictatorial regime that's been in power for over a half a century. And so that might be a little bit too hasty. But look, to be sure, there's probably nothing more that most of the Syrian refugees want than to return to stable homes and a peaceful environment. But on the role of the EU, I think the key thing here will be, again, money and being able to raise...
As always, it's all about money. On that point, I'm going to have to conclude you there. As I said, Foreign Affairs Ministers will meet on Monday. There's also a big EU summit taking place as well next week here in Brussels. We'll keep you posted on that. But thank you to our panellists and thank you for watching. Stay with us, though, because after the break, we will be telling you why France is in deep trouble. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with my panel, we're just taking a look back at the news of the week. And while most of us in European cities are slipping into festive mode and enjoying the Christmas markets, Paris is in panic mode. The government of Prime Minister Michel Barnier collapsed in a vote of no confidence just a few months after those snap legislative elections in the summer called by President Emmanuel Macron on the very night of the European Parliament elections. With the French economy in tatters and the French people divided, the situation seems pretty dire. For more on how the French president is doing right now, our correspondent Sofia Katskinskova sent us this update.
Macron's popularity rating is in freefall. For many, the French leader is to blame for the country's mess. According to a latest Ipsos poll, his popularity rating plunged more than 7 percentage points since September. And with a 23% approval rating, well, this is the lowest level recorded for the French leader since the start of his second term in office. This tense social and political climate also reflects how deeply divided France is. 43% of French people say that they belong to an angry and fragmented nation. And with still no budget in sight for next year and a hung parliament, well, it looks like Macron is in for a long and tedious end to his last term in office.
That was Euronews' Paris correspondent Sofia Katskinskova. Nessim, we're going to turn to you first, our French politics expert here. What is your take? It looks very, very bad for Macron.
Yes, well, what we are saying is clearly that it is a political crisis, and I think a political crisis that is intensifying. We had the snapshot elections in just right after what could be named as a defeat for Macron during the European elections, and what the legislative elections with the new Popular Front finishing first, and Macron trying to push forward what would be a support, like the continuation of his politics through the Barnier government, but it did not resist to the proof of the budget.
It didn't work, and the country seems pretty stuck now because with no prime minister, they can't really get anything done, Maria.
Exactly. I remember, actually, it came to mind that you and I remember in the show that we did back in September already, we were debating and having the same conversation. And I remember at the time, I remember this very well. I remember I said, he's going to have to find someone that can get the budget done, but also can stick it out for maybe 6 months. And already that is bare minimum for a government. And not even that. I think that shows, on the one hand, how politically tricky, because basically, you nailed it in some ways. The government that he put in place did not fully reflect the outcome of the snap election. Again, Macron has been repeating, no one won the election. It's a very divided assembly. So therefore, we need a government that can somehow just put this budget forward and deal with the pressing economic matters. But obviously, politics always usually trumps everything. And then you didn't mention Marine Le Pen. I was expecting you'd mention her at some point. But look, she's under pressure for a number of issues, some of them legal. She wanted to show, and this has been her number one priority, I may not be in government. The plan to put Barnier as prime minister may have not worked, but I am the woman in the shadows that's running the government, and that's exactly what she did.
She's still waiting. She's hoping to move into the Elysee in 2027, Bart.
She is, and I had a conversation yesterday with a number of senior French officials whether they think Macron might step down sometime earlier, and they were convinced, and I'm convinced as well, that he would not. And this he'll stick out until 2027. Look, 3 years is a long time in politics. A lot can change between now and then. It is interesting how divided France is. And in fact, it's sort of maybe a nature of modern politics that many of our democracies are quite internally divided. And maybe it's a function of the media landscape. Maybe it's a function of other dynamics. But look, for Europe writ large and for the West writ large, it's actually a good thing that France still has a very centralized foreign policy in the president, and so that can continue. And so while internally, the budget issues are incredibly important, and a lot of the domestic politics will drive Macron's day-to-day activities, in Europe-wide and internationally, France can still play a role of stability to try to get a lot of the things that we need to get done.
And just you mentioned Emmanuel Macron, he says he's not going anywhere. He's staying put until 2027. And in his speech last week, he said, some are tempted to blame me, but I have always assumed my responsibilities. I will never assume the irresponsibilities of those who have chosen to bring down France's budget and government. He's clearly pointing the finger there at the far right and the far left.
Yes, exactly. Well, this is a bit of a real Macron quote and an exercise here, where he's clearly pointing out to someone else's responsibility in the current situation, and we could imagine that. Well, we were mentioning the discontent of the French population. We can imagine that the French population is seeing it a bit differently. And as you were saying, you rightly mentioned Marine Le Pen, and I think this is what also the bet that Macron took, but by putting Barnier, who's we have to remember. The leader of a party that arrives only fourth in the legislative elections, which is not also a common practice in the French legislative practices, which means that he basically gave the keys to Marine Le Pen, and we saw that when she saw that the political cost of supporting the government would be too high, she definitely decided.
And that's very interesting, because even in a moment where markets, and I think this is what changed this time around, there was pressure from financial markets, who in some ways, and this is sometimes what's beautiful about market forces, they sort of don't care so much about the political dramas. They're just looking at the numbers, and what they see is a deficit that is growing. What they see is a debt pile that has kept increasing, and what they want to see is a real effort from the government to address that. Even in a week when financial markets really piled pressure on French assets in markets, she still went for the political angle. And I think sometimes that's a disconnect between the financial aspects and the politics. There was a real question as to whether France was in a political crisis turning into a financial crisis. I think that's an exaggeration. The comparison with Greece, frankly, I don't think it works when you compare, French debt to Greek debt at the peak of a crisis in which we were debating whether the Greeks would pull out of the euro or not. I think that's a sexy comparison, but it doesn't really address the situation. But it does show that at times the politics really trumps the financial incentives, and I think that was perhaps the miscalculation for Michel Barnier. I think he saw this in a very rational way. Politics is not always rational.
But here,
indeed, and on that point, we can conclude that conversation. As everyone else gets ready for Christmas, we'll keep an eye on that story in France and keep you posted. And of course, for more on that, you can check out euronews.com. But for now, thank you so much to our panellists for being with us, and thank you so much for watching. We'll see you soon on Euronews. Hello there, you're watching Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly politics show where we take a look at the big stories making news. I'm Maeve McMahon and I'm joined by Bart Shevchik from the German Marshall Fund, Maria Tadeo, a correspondent with La Grande Continent, and Nessim Ashouch with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And we're just taking a look, as I said, back at the news. And one that we had to mention was this. After 20 years of talks, the EU sealed a deal with Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay on free trade. The so-called Mercosur trade deal will slash customs and facilitate business investments for all those doing commerce in these markets. Many welcome the news, but some are absolutely devastated. Let's hear what our panel think of the deal. Nassim?
Well, looking at the French situation, this is a complicated moment for Macron with the signing of Ursula von der Leyen, because he knows that most of the population, but also mostly the French farmers, being the bigger industry, all the smaller farmers are really against the trade, the Mercosur deal.
And that's why they've been protesting for months. But meanwhile, the business community here are celebrating, cracking out bottles of champagne because tariffs will be cut.
If I may take a broader perspective, perhaps, one of the big questions now I think that we've all asked ourselves is, why now? I mean, what changed so this deal could finally go through? I think there's three final elements, and one includes the industry, as you say. Look, I think one is, frankly, the war in Ukraine. I think the war in Ukraine changed a lot of things. You can't credibly say as the EU, we need to reach out to new partners. We have to diversify our supply chain. We need to engage with countries like Latin America because there's a very attractive Chinese offer too on the market, and then reject an agreement like that. I think also when you look at the players here involved, Ursula von der Leyen wanted to get this deal done, but also the Brazilian president, President Lula, he wanted to get this deal done. Remember last year when he was in Brussels, he made it very clear that Brazil believed this is not just a trade deal, it's a political partnership, and wanted to get it over the finish line. And then lastly, in that, I think you alluded to this perfectly, is the industry and the lobby behind this. We know that Germany wanted it, the Spanish wanted it. The German industry at this point, they will get any market they can get because they're in a very difficult position. The Spanish, huge market, Spanish speaking, they wanted this deal, put the combination together, and you get Mercosur.
And we talk constantly about the trouble the car sector is in right now. Of course, they will benefit hugely from this. The chemical sector, and also the EU would gain access to raw materials that they need, like lithium, which they need for car batteries. Your take, Bart?
I think Maria is on point on this, where Europe really needs to find good economic opportunities anywhere it can find them, because the truth is that the economic picture in Europe is quite bleak. Over the past 15 years, the EU's share of global GDP has plummeted from 25% to 17%. If you want to get a different data point, 15 years ago, the Eurozone economy was basically the same as America's. And now America's is nearly double that of the Eurozone, 80% larger. And so this is a big wake-up call for Europeans that, something needs to change and it needs to improve its competitiveness and productivity. And one way to do that is through these trade agreements. Now, you also have to make sure that the trade agreements protect your climate goals, because that's existential for us, as well as your labor rights and protections on that front. But certainly, if you can find new markets for your car industry, that's great. And one of the ways that Europe will be able to improve its economic growth is through new trade deals.
And let's just bring in fact, a representative from those farmer protests that we mentioned earlier. They are concerned that they will be priced out of the market, and that's why they've been on the streets of Brussels and beyond for many, many months. Take a listen now to Pierre Maison.
The
EU Mercosur agreement is very unfair for Europe. It may be good for car sales, but it will be very bad for agriculture. And it's going to hurt small producers again, because it's going to sink prices. Putting cargo ships on the ocean to transport things that we can produce at home, for us, it's an aberration.
Pour nous, c'est une aberration.
Pierre Maison there. I mean, it was always controversial, wasn't it, this deal, and especially in France, as you mentioned?
It's good that you mentioned the climate question, because we have to remember that the climate crisis is still there, and we have to also to remember that Macron, some few years ago, really resisted the deal, mentioning the deforestation that would happen with the Mercosur passing, and the question of the soy plantation. This resistance coming from farmers is on one base economical, but is also looking at the overall picture, looking at the climate crisis. And to be honest, those trade deals, it's hard to assess sometimes their economic benefits as well.
Well, I mean, according to economists, the benefits will be huge. But of course, the objective of politicians now, when it gets ratified and implemented, will be to appease those farmers and make sure that they feel it doesn't hurt their daily lives, Bart.
Well, look, I mean, the underlying logic of promoting trade is still there, but what sometimes does not happen is to make sure that those groups that lose out or don't benefit from the new trade deals get compensated and get also some benefits out of the overall pie. So I think that second step is very, very important. But I think stepping back a little bit here, it's important to also celebrate, when we have them. And here, after 20 years of negotiations, it's good to be able to put close to this chapter and to declare victory and to move on. Because if you look around the world, ongoing war in Ukraine, instability in the Middle East, there are not that many things to celebrate. And so if you can have something that we actually have been able to accomplish as the EU, I think that's a good thing.
But I'm not totally sure that we can compensate the deforestation in the Amazon or the polluting of some of the rivers in South America. So this is something that will also have like an impact in the overall population.
And just finally, Maria, that's very tricky, isn't it? I think some probably watching this are celebrating and some are mourning.
Yeah, I think
that's the tricky thing right now, how divided we are.
I think Mercosur, just as an idea, when you look at France, I don't see how there's any way, there's no amount of concessions that will now change the public perception on this deal, because it has become sort of, it's a lightning rod, it's in the zeitgeist, and it's a form of psyche rejection now to this deal. I think also you mentioned a great point, Bart, because you said when there's a deal we should celebrate. That's something the Germans were also saying before the arrival of President Trump. We're showing to the world that you can cut big trade deals that are potentially beneficial for both and follow rules. The one thing that I would say, and this goes back to your point, the farmers, this is a very key strategic group of society in European politics. We saw it at the start of the year, a lot of protests, obviously for politicians. They know in the public opinion there's a positive perception of farmers because they make our food. Obviously, this is a sector that works hard. And this is the point for Italy, because this deal, in my view, will sink or fly in the European Parliament, but also when you look at the Council, whether Giorgia Meloni is able to strike that balance. And it's going to be very, very difficult, keep people happy and the industry.
And we'll keep a close eye on that debate when it happens in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. But for now, we can bring our conversation to an end. Thank you so much, Bart, Maria and Nassim, for being our panel this weekend. And thank you for watching. Any comments on anything you've heard, do reach out. Brussels mylove@Euronews is our email address. You can also find us on social media and we will send you a direct message if you reach out. Take care and see you soon here on Euronews.